Hello, I'm Thomas Adams. What is ethical subjectivism? We can think of it like a chess game. In chess, you are the one that's making the moves. But you're not the only one. Someone else, from their own vantage point, is going to be making their move as well. Now, there's certain things that ethical subjectivism gets confused with. Certain things that it's not. For one, it's not ethical skepticism. I can't move the pieces any way I want, nor can I try to rearrange things in a completely new setup than the one that is put down. Ethical subjectivism is also not moral uncertainty. Anyone who's ever played chess before knows that the timer puts that aside. You have to make a decision eventually. Now, the decisions that you make can have consequences, and those consequences can help shape what further happens. Now, looking at the chess game of our lives, one of the major elements that ethical subjectivism gets confused with is tolerance. Now, tolerance is a universal principle. It's one in which all views ought to be tolerated. With a subjective point of view, if you are the one that is playing, you are the one that wants to win, you are the one that's in the driver's seat. You are not concerned about tolerating others. You may or you may not. I think of the scene from the famous chess film Searching for Bobby Fischer, where before the big finale, the protagonist realizes that he is in a position to win and offers a draw. And the other player, looking at the same board, does not accept. Remember, what one person does, the other person does not have to accept. Eventually, you put your opponent in a situation where they cannot compete. Now, that adversarial role is not inherent to an ethical subjective view, but you are the one putting the pieces in play. Now, the chessboard that I have here is set up to evoke the Civil War. And a certain piece in particular, the knight, has a special emphasis for two reasons. First, I think of my favorite movie. In the movie Dances with Wolves, the character of John J. Dunbar, played by Kevin Costner, at the very beginning, really makes a name for himself. In fact, ironically, and he says this in the movie, in trying to produce my own death, I found myself elevated to the status of a hero. What he does is, on a battlefield in which each of the two sides are equally parlayed, he sets out on what might be termed a suicide ride. But what he actually does is he inspires those around him to fight. And the negated chess match, in which nothing is happening, actually turns into a pitched battle. A battle which the North eventually wins. And in the long run, in terms of the war, the North eventually wins as well. His movement is very much like that of the knight, one of the few pieces that can move not only forward, but also forward and to the side, can go over and around. And the figure of the knight has been one from the medieval times of chivalry all the way back to the ancient philosophical exploits of Hector going up against his arch nemesis Achilles. The knight has a special place, not only on the chessboard of our lives, but also within the story of America. If we think of what the knight is not the king. One of our preeminent founding fathers, in fact, the founding father, would be George Washington. And George Washington can be seen as the knight. He can be seen as the person trying to put into perspective his views. Now, from his point of view, from his own ethical subjectivism, George Washington was upholding principles that he felt were in dire need of sacrifice, that he was doing the right thing. From the point of view of his adversaries, though, George Washington's position was pretty close to how the Continental Army would later on view Benedict Arnold. He was seen as a traitor to the British cause, but from the other vantage point, he is seen as the leader, not of a rebellion against, but a revolution for. So if we keep that in mind, we can see that how we view the circumstances in our lives might be subjective, but it could be based upon universal principles. That is what the side of Washington, the side of the Continental Army wanted to do, put into play those principles that they felt were universal, as well as in the Declaration of Independence stating forth why they were doing what they were doing. In somewhat of an odd way, it was an emphatic emphasis on a subjective view based upon universal principles. Probably the most famous painting of Washington is the crossing of the Delaware. There's a lesser-known painting that is subsequent to that, before the famous Battle of Trenton. And in this painting, you can see Washington in the foreground, closest in perspective, and everything is in nice detail. But in the horizon, across the way, it's in a haze. You have certainty and uncertainty. And that's one of the elements here that ethical subjectivism tries to bring into play. How do we go from the certain to the uncertain? How do we go from what we know to what we might not? And in doing so, this approach emphasizes that what we do will designate the truth of our actions, and how others respond will give us new circumstances to react to. How will we react to those circumstances? Or ethically speaking, how are we going to put those principles into play? Well, to answer that in the spirit of the ethical philosophy, it's your move.